Nigel, I'm going to drop on you first and say, what's landed for you? What's new?
So I was just saying to David that the most emotional reaction I had in myself to the 6 poems was in the cup poem. I've forgotten the title of it.
I look in that cup you've been drinking from.
There you go. And because there wasn't a happy ending in it, and at our table, I think struggled with the sense that it didn't resolve itself, and yet to go back to the talk and the paper I gave. I do like Elaine Heath's work, if you know her work, and I did invite her to a day conference in Birmingham, just down the road, earlier this year, and she did say the church needs to go to hell. And that's quite a statement, isn't it? But I think she's right. And in my own experience, I know I don't want to do that. I know I don't want to drink the cup, even look in it. I mean, it's just, I did everything I could to avoid those ladies having that conversation about, were we going to do this practice or not. I was avoiding it because I didn't want to go to the possibility that they might just chuck it back in my face and say, stuff this, we're done. And I know that that's the challenge of my discipleship now is to face the darkness, this really difficult place of actually maybe there isn't an Easter Sunday, maybe that Easter Saturday is it. And if I'm not prepared to actually live with that possibility, then Easter Sunday will never happen in the depth that it does happen for me, and it will always be a shallower experience. And that's to do, I think, with for me, the way in which God is, it's called the aseity of God, if I'm right. God is sufficient in God's self. And as I said earlier on, Francis Young does not need to be needed. How do we get out of that bottom left quadrant of Anna's? Well, we have to stop needing to be needed. And that's to do with, can we reflect the God who is, as opposed to needs us to do anything. And that's to do with my journey into contemplation, and simply being silent. Because that's an utterly useless activity. Utterly useless. And yet, it's the thing that makes me more alive than anything, in a really, really weird way. And it's the most difficult thing I've ever attempted to do, but it is, and I don't do it for this reason, but it is really truly fruitful. So that takes me to Meister Eckhart. If you know Meister Eckhart, I mean, he was a bit dodgy, it seems to me, at some levels. If you want to have that,
they're often the best, most interesting people.
but he lives on the edge of orthodoxy and heterodoxy, and that's an interesting question. Nevertheless, his prayer, "God, free me from God," does strike me as a really important prayer, because I think one of the things that people outside the church accuse Christians of, and I've heard it several times, is being God bothered. And they've sussed it, they've clocked it. That it's our need. It's mass crook. It's the thing we put on. It's actually, Meister Eckhart says, most of what the church does, clergy, lay, whatever, is just out of our need, somehow our ego, to prove that ourselves before God. Whereas actually, God's not interested in any of that stuff. But it's really hard to get through that too. The place of being ourselves without our ego in the way.
That kind of
think that links to what we've been talking about just now, which was, how you engage with people who maybe in that old dog church place, who don't want to live, as it were. And I'm talking about, the need to engage with people at the level of their meaning system, which we're reflecting back on that. But that's something that but I think what you're saying just now prompts me to add that that's something that we kind of need to do for ourselves first. And that although it is partly about, it's partly mental, it's about mindset, it's about how we see the world, how we see God, how we see things, it has a very strong personal and kind of emotional content. It's not we're not just talking, it might be about the renewal of one's mind, but that's not just at the level of kind of ideas.
No way. No.
This is it's at the level of who we are and how we engage.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Anna, anything landed for you?
Lots and lots of thoughts, all of which are sort of floating around in the ether, but I guess something that perhaps sums it up is thinking about church and thinking about community in relation to power, and just being very aware in all of our conversations today the different kinds of stories that are told. So the rhetoric that we wrap around our activities, the stories we tell about what it is and how it works and what happens as a result of it. And then there's the kind of, so they might be glorifying stories, or they might be woe is me stories, woe is us stories. And then there's the kind of caricatures, the kind of satire that's written perhaps about us, or that we perceive that other people are, stories they're telling about us. And then there's our assumptions and the assumptions of others that overlay our experiences. And somewhere in the midst of all of these different kinds of narratives, there's as close as damn it as we can get to raw experience. There's the things that happen to us, the things we see, and how we understand those realities. And it just strikes me in the midst of all of this today that all of these things are so important in relation to power and in relation to change, actually, to understand the rhetoric, to notice the caricatures, to identify the assumptions, and to pay attention to our experiences and the realities around all of those things. So I guess I'm coming back both in church life and in community life to self-awareness and to attentiveness, that we might have a heightened awareness of these different layers of understandings of our experiences, really, and that might help keep us attentive to power and able to navigate its complexity. And I think that is the task. The task is to navigate the complexity rather than to sort that out. So I feel, I guess, a renewed kind of sense of the importance of that self-awareness and noticing attentiveness.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Lucy.
I've written down 3 words. Witness. We talked about testimony and we talked about personal experience, but I actually think that there's something which that Sonia did and which is terribly important, which is to say this happened to me. I don't believe we do it enough. I mean, churches and communities, possibly because we're British, or possibly not. But witness is somehow saying, I saw it, or I was there, and it happened. Preaching needs it, and very, very rarely has it. I'm afraid to say, well, possibly only in my denomination. Probably you all have splendid witness preaching. Now, I don't mean that preaching has to revolve around personal experience, but it somehow has to anchor itself into people's personal experience, so that somehow when they're talking about the Bible, this is me talking from my own experience as well, of knowing it and feeling it enough that people think you were there. I think that's immensely important. And if the lectionary reading doesn't float your boat, then just go off piste and choose another one. Yeah? The second one is anger. We're not good at anger. Nothing changes without anger, and I'm not talking about temper. There is no such thing as righteous temper, but there is righteous anger, and we don't do it very often. It's so important. The trouble is we're also not good at managing it when it happens, especially in local churches. But it's essential because it's the point at which people are caring the most and where they've taken risks and are showing the most of themselves, and anger is witness. And I wondered where the anger was today. There must be some, because everybody is here because they think things should be happening that aren't happening. Maybe it's because we're sharing and we know that we all that we share that. Or maybe it's just that we're very good at not doing anger. I don't know. And the last one is trust, and trust in me is that none of this, that there are two things. I trust that the church will exist long after I don't recognise it as church anymore. And so I don't care what happens. I want to do what's in front of me. I was saying to somebody at lunchtime, as far as I'm concerned, the United Reform doesn't have a creed. That's because none of us agree with one another. We have absolutely no central tenets. My central tenet is, if it's in front of you, do it. It's a bit like Nike. Just do it. And so there's a sense to me that if we always did what was in front of us, right in front of us outside our doors, that's the task. So that's my creed. So, and the trust is that God has put outside your door what you're supposed to do next. That's what I've thought about.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Other reflections, other sedimentations. Okay. Other takeaways. Yeah, they could have done better than sedimentation, surely. What were we talking about a minute ago? Believe me, you're all talking about something.
We were talking about Jesus in his ministry, the way that he talked to people, not using rational, logical laws, rules, that sort of stuff, but using story. And David had a lovely phrase. Jesus, he used it earlier, Jesus was living the lifestyle of heaven before people's eyes. And his parables, etc., was Jesus explaining the heavenly lifestyle he was living. I really like that. The way he... that there's something about how that the church maybe isn't, maybe I'm interpreting what he's saying now, but the church doesn't have that same ability to connect with people in that same way across rational and emotional levels. I think the nice thing about having poetry as well as speaking is that the poetry is, even if it annoys us as well as inspires us, but it's connecting emotionally. It's certainly not boring us. It wasn't me. So.
Thank you. Something that reminds me of something about noticing, which has come through as a theme several times. Because part of, in fact, I think it came from all three speakers in there, because witness is also about, as Mike Eaton was pointing out to us in last year's conference, witnessing is also about noticing. You can only bear witness testimony to something you've noticed. Other reflections. please.
I think there was some. I'm trying to link up a few things in my head, and sorry, I'm a verbal processor, so you just get all of it. There was some stuff in the beginning about, like, we don't really know. It's quite difficult to talk about God and stuff for some people. I don't find it difficult, but I think in some of the changing of maybe the culture, the way that we do things, and coming along with more of that realistic stuff, I'm kind of linking that up with some of the stuff Anna said about how we get our results. So, like, getting our results from the people who are having the mission done to them is probably the way to put it. But the results not being a list of confirmations and baptisms and that's how it's working and that's the proof, but that it is the quote, the storytelling, the thing of, Tracy said life's like this now. Dave's really glad we're just here every week still and he can't believe we still keep coming. You know, that kind of stuff being shared back in church and that kind of language being used about where God's at and what God's doing. And then also, obviously, in the way that we were talking about, hang on, this ministers to us too, can also then help fix us, change the culture around in that way, the language that we start using with each other as we start acknowledging, oh, maybe God did that, or that was a God moment, or what, you know, that can kind of come back on itself. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. Okay.
Cool.
Yep.
I wonder if I may just say that what Nigel said about the church needing to go to hell, or words to that effect.
That's exactly what I said, quoting Leahy.
It struck me, and it's been reinforced by a lot of the things that have come up today, is that the gospel we have to present is going to be reduced unless we understand the enormity of evil. And because we live in safe, relatively speaking, England that hasn't been at war for 70-something years on our land, we believe that peace is the norm. And because of the recent debates nationally about nuclear deterrence and that sort of thing, I've been doing quite a bit of thinking and a little bit of writing on it. And when war really gets going, and I'm not talking about defensive war, I'm talking about aggressive war, the manifestations of evil that are then apparent are absolutely appalling. There is, and I'm just thinking of the war against the Japanese, or the Japanese against the Allies, but the war in Japan, from Japan, there was such a demonic element to the intensity of evil that was willing to be perpetrated in order not to lose. And I'm talking about the kamikaze, the emperor worship. The whole nation was bound up in the atrocities, really. And there is, if one reads the stories of Second and First World Wars and so on, you can see how the aggressors embody a rage that is so profound that they cannot control it or stop it or bring it to closure except by getting total triumph at the end. And so you had Hitler willing to have his whole nation destroyed and willing for Berlin to be brought to ruin, because until the moment he committed suicide, he wouldn't consider any other path. And so there's a demonic rage, so to speak, that evil can bring into a nation that is insatiable.
How's that linked to today?
Because it is to do with us keeping in mind the intensity of darkness that is potentially present in our world through evil. And unless, as Christians, we have an understanding of that intensity of evil that can burst out, our gospel is going to be reduced in what we're trying to present to people.
There's an American writer whose name I can never remember who writes about the disenchantment of Western middle class life, that we live in a very safe, rational, ordered place. But he does a Bible study in a prison in America and says that when he goes into there, the men who he works with, they have no problem at all with demonic because they're in a completely different world of evil and powers that have control over them. So when he does a Bible study in his home church and they're dealing with Jesus dealing with demons, they're all very ever so, we're not very comfortable with all this. And he goes into the prison as the Bible study and they get it completely. They're powers of evil. Richard Beck. Yeah, Richard Beck. And he's written books on it, and it's absolutely fascinating that for those of us who are middle class, live in a safe world and can't imagine the bottom falling out of our world because we've got safety nets and blankets and parents with houses, all the rest of it. And yet the communities that we're working with are much more, it's in a different place altogether. And he talks,
safe.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You know, I'm not comfortable with the language of demons, and yet the power of evil and the demonic and that sort of stuff in our communities, that our certain community I'm in, they can cope with that stuff, no problem at all, because it's how they, there are powers that perpetrate evil.
I think the flip side's also true. It's like, if we don't see many miracles today in our churches, it's not because God stopped doing miracles, it's because we don't need him to, because we have that comfortable life. But you go out somewhere where there's real need, you start praying about it, I guarantee you're going to start seeing miracles because God's going to show up and meet people where their need is.
I live, a boy was shot dead a quarter of a mile from where I live, fairly recently. And lots of awful things happen in Wood Green because I'm so close to Tottenham. And probably about 20% of the people who walk past are on medication or are sleeping rough. So, and I could not write what I wrote if I didn't live there. You know, the darkness of what's in some of this is because I'm living in I'm not living in Kensington where I grew up. If I was still living where I grew up, I wouldn't be here.
What particularly struck me was your poem about the cup and the bitterness and the vileness and the power of the evil that was in that cup. Really struck home with me.
Anything else has landed?
I'll just say that I was enormously helped by what Sonia said earlier, by the way. When you said you hoped you would, he did.
Thank you. If not, then I think let's start drawing things together. Well, I suppose I could have a go. One of the things that's definitely landed for me is the connection between something Nigel said about the difficulty we have in making God the subject of a sentence with a verb. And I can trot out phrases about seeing what God's doing and joining in with it, with the best of them. But that sentence only works if you can find sentences about what God's doing. And I am very suspicious of people's sentences about what God's doing because I have heard so much drivel, I think, where people have seized upon what their will wishes and attributed it to God. But so I have a struggle with that, but I can see I think that's a very powerful thing. And that connected with the top right-hand box of Anna's diagram about being with. What's the top right-hand box in there?
Solidarity.
Solidarity, yes. and sort of something that's landed for me is something about solidarity, in the sense of so what does solidarity with God look like? That's one of the things which I would have said if I asked that question. What's landed?
Many rooms. The house has many rooms. Rooms for washing, rooms for resting, rooms for those being born and those being born again, and a room for wishing you'd never been born at all. There are rooms for forgetting and for remembering and mourning. There are rooms for madness, giving onto wide, gracious rooms for anger, regret, and grief. There are rooms for understanding things misunderstood. There are rooms for the exercising of skill without artifice. Rooms for dancing joyfully and badly to foreign musics. There are rooms full of babies beginning their toddlings and very, very old souls finishing their totterings. And no rooms at all where endings are denied, beginnings prevented, or death unallowed. There is no room in the house where ugly truth cannot be spoken, no room where torture cannot be mentioned, where wrongs cannot be discussed, where bluffs cannot be called. There are rooms full of old, useless rubbish which you burn in the garden. The meeting rooms of the house are for souls who intend meeting, with round tables where they can put all their cards. Among all these rooms walk private souls, keeping no secrets, loving without leering, joking without jeering, planning without plotting. There are rooms for visions and for unknowing. The house has no locked rooms, just keys and keys and keys, and the windows let in breeze like breath. And every still thing can move, and every small thing can grow, and every broken thing can mend, and every great thing can fall, and every dead thing can live, and nothing which is dying is prevented from dying. The landlord has forbidden the use of more than one face, and has banned sentiment, agenda, suspicion, gossip. You may leave at any time to suit yourself. To feel truly at home in every room of the house is what gains you entry, and costs vary.